Christians to study your word and to grow spiritually, grow closer to you, to learn lessons from your word, and we may carry them out into our everyday lives and impact those around us. We pray we open our minds to every opportunity that presents itself to us to be of service to others, and we pray that we take advantage of those opportunities. Pray for an open mind this morning to hear Mark's message. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
I assume the alternate class is not meeting because your dad's voice, right? Okay.
He's feeling rough today.
Feeling rough. Okay, so Mark Yarborough has had gotten over his voice, his throat troubles, got it back, got some again. So it's that time of year, the season's changing. Everyone, every which way, and that made everybody cough at once, didn't it? So, but anyway, and things are starting to bloom as well if you have allergies. But it's good that those that could make it made it. We're glad to be here. Been looking at, for those who have not been in here, we've been looking at the book of Esther. Interesting story. What's one of the most unusual aspects of the book of Esther? God is not mentioned in the book of Esther. But is God in the book of Esther? From beginning to end, isn't he? You see the providential working of God. And one thing I mentioned is kind of interesting as we look at Esther. You know, you look at Genesis and you have the flood, the direct action of God there. You have the creation. You have the plagues that took place. Everything is very visual, God at work. You have miracles and so many, and God mentioned left and right. But in the book of Esther, it's more like we are today in the sense that God is at work throughout the book of Esther, putting things in place and making it work out. But you don't see God miraculously and visibly, directly. Like he didn't just send fire down from heaven and kill Haman, but Haman was killed. For his part in trying to kill all the Jews. You see God's work all around. Just like today, God is still active and still in control, and we can see his work and the proof of God around us, but it's in a different sense than you think about like in the first century with the miracles and such. But we've gotten to the point in the lesson where Esther was made queen. Well, Vashti was kicked out because the king got mad at her for not displaying herself for everyone. And then they had a contest to get a new queen, and Esther was chosen. And now we were introduced to to Haman, who did not like Mordecai because Mordecai would not bow down to him. Mordecai, Esther's cousin that raised her as his own. And so here it kind of set everything up. Haman did not like being slighted. Everyone's supposed to kind of bow to him or just really worship him, if you will. And Mordecai would not, and it just ate at him. Why will he not do it? I'm going to get even with him. And he decided to get even with him by not just destroying Mordecai, but Mordecai was a Jew, so I'll get rid of all the Jews. And there seems to be a bias in some corners of the empire against the Jews at that time. But one thing led to another, and eventually we find out that Haman's going to be found out. Any comments before we get into the lesson? Esther decides to I missed the most important part. Mordecai told Esther, you need to go tell the king what's going on here about the plot to kill all the Jews. And the king had signed it in writing that all the Jews could be killed. He didn't realize it was the Jews. He just knew it was a nation that he was told would rise up against them. But Mordecai found out about it, sent word to Esther and told Esther, you may have been placed in this place for such a time as this. You got to stand up. And she does. She goes before the king and makes a request to have a banquet together, a meal for her and the king and for Haman. And then at that banquet, he goes, okay, what do you want? I know there's something that you want besides this. And she said, come to my banquet tomorrow and I'll tell you what I want. And so in the meantime, Haman had decided that he went home and talked to his wife and friends, and they said, you need to make a request to the king that Mordecai be hung. And they built a 75-foot tall gallows of some type. And he said, you go request it, you have Mordecai hung on those gallows, and then we can go have at that banquet and you can have a good time. And so that was the plan. So between the night between the first banquet and the second banquet, Esther 6:1 takes place. And it says, that night the king could not sleep. You know, sometimes we can't, you may be where you can't sleep, and you might go in there and turn the TV on. Well, he didn't have TVs to turn on. And so I guess you read some sleepy reading. He asked for the book of the records of the Chronicles to come and to be read before the king. What is the book of the records of the Chronicles? History book. You know, it tells all the things that have been done. And some people are history buffs and like that. They like the legal side of things and remember things. Others may not. But whatever the case, he just thought it'd be kind of good to go back through and see what's happening and maybe be reminded of some people's names or certain events that he had forgotten about. And that's what happens here. I mean, he can't sleep, and he's having it read to him. And it was found written that Mordecai had told Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers, who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. We saw that earlier in our study for those that have been in here, how these two gatekeepers had decided to rise up against the king, and Mordecai found out about it. He overheard their planning, and he had word sent to the king and saved the king's life. And, of course, King Ahasuerus was happy about that, but the king said, what honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? What have we done? He deserves something. He saved my life. And the king's servants who attended him said, nothing has been done for him. Now, you think about, you save the king's life and you don't get any kind of award, reward, you don't get any kind of honor or anything. How would you feel? Slighted? I don't think Mordecai worried about that so much. But from the king's point of view, you know, that was an oversight there. He had forgotten to give any honor to him, and he just knew that looked bad. I mean, Mordecai deserved some type of recognition for the great thing that he did. I mean, you think about, you know, soldiers in battle that get different awards and medals, and here's one that saved the king's life. Surely that deserves something. And the king said, who is in the court? Now, Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to suggest that the king hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. I mean, you got to see God's hand in all this, how it's just all lining up perfectly. He's there to get the king to kill Mordecai while the king is reading that Mordecai deserves to be honored. And so, but the king wants one of his advisors there, one of the servants that can advise him, to come up with some great way to be able to honor Mordecai and to use him in that. And they said, well, Haman's here. You know, he's waiting to see you. And so Haman came in. The king asked him, what shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? Now, what does Haman think? Who else could it be? I mean, because Haman, a very arrogant person, a very self-centered type of person, really a narcissistic kind of individual when you look at his attitude, not worried about everybody else, just worried about Haman. And in his mind, he's thinking, surely the king's talking about me, because look at me. I've been invited in to eat with the queen and the king. No one else was there. And he's let me use his signet ring before as well. And now Haman thought in his heart, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? Well, that's an arrogant attitude. Pride comes before a fall. And he's going to experience a fall like he doesn't want to experience. Haman answered the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let a royal robe be brought which the king has worn. He's thinking about, here's what I would like. And a horse on which the king has ridden, which has a royal crest placed on its head. So you can see all the attention that he gathered there. You're riding on the king's horse. You're with a royal crest on it. You have a robe that the king himself has actually worn. And then let the robe and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor. So you send one of your most loyal princes out to put that robe on that person, to make sure they look really good, put them on that horse, and then parade him on horseback through the city square and proclaim before him, thus shall it be to the man whom the king delights to honor. Can you imagine he's picturing that in his mind, what he'd look like on that horse with a king's robe? And I mean, you know, I'm sure he would probably see himself even as king in the right circumstances. And so he's thinking, boy, this is going to be wonderful. I mean, he had some news to tell his wife earlier about the banquet, but boy, this will let everyone know just how great and important he is. Now here's where things turn. The king said to Haman, "Hurry, take the robe and the horse as you have suggested, and do so for Mordecai the Jew who sits within the king's gate. Leave nothing undone of all that you have spoken." Boy, by his own words, don't you imagine he wished he had not said anything? I mean, he probably wished, at least he should have asked, well, who do you have in mind so I can think something appropriate for them? But he was so sure in his mind and heart it was him. And now he has to turn around and do all these things to Mordecai, the one that he wanted killed. That, I'm sure he dreamed all the night before. Mordecai's death, Mordecai's death, Mordecai's death. And now all of a sudden he's got to honor Mordecai. So, well, what could he do? He had to do it, didn't he? Or die. So Haman took the robe and the horse, arrayed Mordecai, led him on horseback through the city square, and proclaimed before him. Now he has to proclaim this. Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. And so, what does Mordecai do after all this? Okay, now Haman went back to the house and cried. What did Mordecai do? All these names get twisted around. I mean, it doesn't, do what? I mean, I don't think that meant as much to Mordecai as it would have to Haman. I mean, Mordecai doesn't try to parade himself around from all we've seen. I mean, he's at work constantly looking out for Esther, making sure she was taken care of when she was waiting to go into the king, after she came back from the king, as queen as well. He's there at the entrance, to the king's palace, taking care of business and checking on it, and he gets back as well. And maybe some of it as well. He knows something's going on here, what's going on here. But whatever the case may be, it's not going around. He didn't have to run to all his friends and say, look at me, look what happened to me. He just goes back and, like you say, business as usual. But as was mentioned as well, Haman hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. We're in Esther chapter 6, Esther 6, and verse 12. I mean, why would he cover his head? He knew he'd put his foot in his mouth? What else? I mean, that's part of it, yes. It's starting to line up, isn't it? I mean, first of all, he was humiliated, wasn't he? I mean, like I say, he stuck his foot in his mouth, and he thought it's going to be all for him, and now all of a sudden he realized, I'm not as important to the king as I thought I was. Mordecai seems to be more so than I am. And plus, if he's going to honor Mordecai, right after he's honored him, how can I go in there and say, hey, let's kill Mordecai? We need to kill him because he doesn't like me. How's that going to look? And so he's trying to figure everything out. He goes back home. He's crying. He's got his head covered. He's embarrassed, ashamed, upset, you name it. When Haman told his wife Sherish and all his friends everything that had happened to him, his wise men and his wife said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. He's a Jew. And now you got all this plan about the Jews. You're going down. He's ascending as you're descending. It's not going to be well. You're going to fall. If heads are going to roll, it's going to be yours. While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs came and hastened to bring Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. Well, he was excited about going. Do you think he's excited right now? I doubt it very seriously. Any comments up to this point? Chapter 7. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. And on the second day at the banquet of wine, the king again said to Esther, what is your petition? Again, she had come before the king without being requested to come see him. And if the king doesn't extend the scepter, you'll be put to death. And so he knew it was something important that Esther wanted to ask of him, because she came without being, he had not called for her in 30 days. And then all of a sudden here, she comes before him. She's risking her life to make a request, and all she asked for is a banquet. And then that day, the day they had the banquet, she said, I want another one, then I'll tell you. And now he's just saying, look, just tell me. I know there's something more than a banquet that you'd risk your life for. The king again said to Esther, what is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Up to half the kingdom, it shall be done. So I'll give you anything you want up to half the kingdom. And, I don't know what he expected. I'm sure it wasn't what she said that he was expecting. But Queen Esther now just lays it all out there and said, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition and my people at my request. Look, if this will make you happy, if this will please you, if you'll agree to this, and if you care about me, there's something I need to be done. I need you to save my life and my people's life. He said, for we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss. I mean, he said, I'm not talking about slavery. I mean, that's bad enough, but I'm talking about being killed, wiped out as a people. So you can imagine the king thinking anything and everything but that, and all of a sudden he's blindsided with this. So King Ahasuerus answered and said to Queen Esther, who is he, and where is he? Who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing? Who would kill my queen? Other than the king himself, I mentioned. But who would kill you? Who would kill your people? And Esther said, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. Boy, Haman was expecting something bad, and he got it. So Haman was terrified before the king and queen. He knew he didn't have long to live, didn't he? Then the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. Why did he go outside at that point? Why do you suppose he just kind of went out and left them there? To think? I mean, he's gotten himself in trouble before making rash decisions, and he got upset with Vashti and had it written in the law of the Medes and Persians for her to be banished from his presence, and I think he kind of regretted that along the way, I think it seems to indicate. But here, he at least goes outside just to keep from killing them with his own hands, I suppose. But whatever the case may be, he goes outside and probably to calm down a little bit or to think a little bit. And so here you are, Haman, the king has gone out. Your one chance at living through all this is with Esther. And so the king arose from his wrath from the banquet of wine, went out into the palace garden, but Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life. For he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. I mean, that's an understatement, isn't it? I mean, of course, here's Haman reaping what he's sown. I mean, he's not a kind-hearted individual. He's not a caring individual. He'd wipe out a whole race of people just because he was slighted a little bit by one individual. When the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, will he also assault the queen while I'm in the house? I mean, it kind of left, he was just pleading for his life. It wasn't anything of trying to attack her in that way. I mean, he was just desperate, and he happened to fall across her. But you can see the image yet. He's seeing red, the king is. He's upset. You shouldn't even touch the queen in any shape, form, or fashion. And then he's kind of laying across her there, begging. And he said, as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. What does that mean? What? His time is gone. You see a person going before the executioner, they kind of put something over their head many times before they are hung or killed. And that seems to be the picture given there. I mean, everyone in the room knew what was going to happen. The servants that are there, the guards that are there, they all know what's going to happen at this point. It's just a matter of timing. And so one of the eunuchs said to the king, look, the gallows 50 cubits high. That's a huge set of gallows there, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman. I mean, they all knew, everyone but the king kind of knew what all the plotting and planning was going on. He said, hey, and in so many words right here, all he's saying is, Haman had built these gallows to hang Mordecai on. Why don't you hang Haman on his own gallows? And so they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath subsided. What are some lessons learned from that? What goes around comes around. You reap what you sow. Yeah, because, I mean, he had risen to great heights, so he had ability. I mean, whether he used it for the right way or not all along, I don't know. He was able to rise through the ranks. But like I say, prejudices and hatred, bitterness, all that, it can cloud your judgment at times and make you do some dumb things. And it led to his death. There's a lesson for us, isn't it? I mean, not that it may not lead to our death, but we don't always think as rationally as we should or as logically as we should when we're angry.
It could lead to your death in a matter of speaking.
Yeah, it can. You talking about
It could separate us from where we want to be.
right?
Eternity.
Yeah, spiritual death. Yeah, a separation from God and from Christ. Yeah, absolutely. But and many times you'll find when you have bitterness or hatred towards someone, who does it usually hurt the worst? Yourself, isn't it? You know, it may not even affect that other person because you'll be angry at them for something. They're just going along living their merry life and not worried about it or whatever, and it's just eating you alive. And but like I said, it can cloud your judgment, your thinking, and I've seen many a life destroyed by that, that kind of either jealousy or hatred or bitterness, or just, you know, you get so consumed with one thing you can't see anything else, and we have to be careful of that. Other thoughts?
When you go back and look, you see where Haman had all these things killed the Jews, and you get to the first part of that chapter, where the king put to sleep, well, it was God intervention, because Esther didn't have to go in and tell him this is why I'm here. He heard it through the chronicles that was read to him.
Right. So,
She might have had to go, had that not happened, and say, look, this is the man that done so and so for you, but God intervened.
yeah, she may have had to remind him that he had to go back and search the records and go, you're right, but he was already aware of
For
it.
some reason he couldn't sleep, and for some reason that was chronicles was read that talked about him.
In the discussion questions, number 2 said, how could Esther 6 be used to illustrate the providence of God? That's one example there. The king just couldn't sleep. Happened to have that one part of the Chronicles read to him. It's a long history there, a lot of things. They could have read anything to him, but they read about Mordecai saving the king's life, and nothing had been done. Right before Haman comes in to ask for Mordecai's life. I mean, that's not an accident. That's God at work. What's another example of God at work? I mean, that you see the providence of God.
God must have been guiding Esther in all these different actions of the king.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, you look at the wisdom that she used in asking them, well, the fasting and praying, I think God, you see God answering those prayers, but the wisdom to have the 2 banquets and how that was used, and God, in between those two, had him drink, you know, had him not sleep and do the things, you know, to have that read to him. Haman happened to come up at the right time, and you look at how Esther handled it and she waited until the perfect moment to reveal, here's what's going on. I mean, you can imagine, it's just like a movie that's written out here, but it's real life. I mean, she didn't just bombard in and have to explain to the king all the history. All the pieces fell into place perfectly right then, right there, where the king could see Haman deserved to die. And, you know, any other thoughts?
How long was Haman on death row?
How many minutes?
The appeals process.
He had his appeals process as he fell on Esther, and they were denied, right? I mean, we think about people on death row, 20, 25 years or so, and then everyone feels, well, not everyone, but many people feel sorry for them, because you forget, you're so far removed from the crime that people begin to be sympathetic toward the one who committed the crime. And, you know, I mean, you do need an appeal. Like we think about it, you need to have a proper appeals thing in case something was not right or it wasn't decided right. But one that goes on for decades, you know, it doesn't really accomplish what you want it to do. It'll eventually take that person's life, but it doesn't really set the example, because I'll have to, like you read about somebody on death row, you have to go back and be reminded of, here's what they did back in the 80s or 90s or whatever, and you have to be reminded of what took place. But here, I mean, it's just...
By that time, everybody's feeling sorry for the one that's going to be executed.
Right, they feel sorry for they consider the one being executed the victim.
Yes.
And I don't, you know, I mean, you look at when they're trying to find a vein to put a needle in and how that's abusive, they'll say. And I mean, I don't, you can look at that how you want, but the bottom line is there's proper justice toward one who took another person's life. And many times in very violent ways, very evil ways, torturing and whatever else that you can imagine. Just unheard of horror, and yet they become the victim. And it's because it's been so long. And here, I'm not saying the second somebody kills somebody, a mob comes and takes them, you need to make sure that the person is guilty of the crime and deserving of the punishment. But here, it goes a little quickly here, but everything, you have a king and a kingdom, and the king can make the decision. It's obvious what was taking place here, that Haman was trying to destroy Mordecai out of jealousy, that he's going to destroy all his people as well, and the queen's life's at stake also. He sees everything, all just come, right there, and the whole picture's there. And like you said, death row, it was a matter of, it took them a few minutes to get over to Haman's house, I'm sure, but right then, it was, the appeals process was over in a matter of minutes or perhaps even seconds, and he's taken out and he's hung. And you can imagine that feeling that he would have as he's being taken toward the gallows, and all the thoughts going through his mind that quickly. Any other comments? Go ahead.
He had exalted himself so high, and then it was a fall right quick.
It's going to be a literal fall, wasn't it? Fall from the gallows, yeah.
I see people do that.
Yeah.
In our time, that get big head, if they get promoted or something, then the fall's where.
Yeah, you got to be careful because pride does come before a fall. Like you say, you get promoted up, but that's going to make it further for you to fall too. What was said over here?
This is God's way of preserving the Jews in which the Jesus lineages would come through.
Yeah, God had promises made, and He's keeping those promises. He's not going to allow Haman or anyone else to stand in the way of that. And God's will is going to be done. But you see God throughout all this. Let's go on over to Esther chapter 8, and it's talking about honor bestowed. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, and Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. So, whether he knew some of this before or not, maybe he didn't put all the connections together there, but now everything's just kind of out on the table. Mordecai did not reveal it earlier. He had his reasons for that, I'm sure. And then, but now everything is out. She's a Jew, he's a Jew, they're cousins. He raised her as his own daughter, and all of that's out as well. So the king took off his signet ring. Oh, by the way, first of all, what's Queen Esther given? The house of Haman. So you can imagine it'd be a very nice place, to say the least. But and all the servants that are there, everything else that's there as well. And so the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai over the house of Haman. So he said, this house of Haman's been given to me. You're over the house of Haman. You have the king's signet ring. Boy, times had changed, hadn't they? The situations had changed. It should be Mordecai that was dead and Haman reigning supreme. Now it's Haman is dead and Mordecai is reigning supreme. Now Esther spoke again to the king, fell down at his feet, implored him with tears. She is his wife, but he's the king. And whether you're his wife or just one of the masses, you answer to the king. And so she's imploring him to counteract the evil from Haman and the scheme which he had devised against the Jews. The king held out the golden scepter toward Esther. That's that acceptance there. I'm not rejecting you, or she came and made a request to him, and he hadn't evidently summoned her to be right there, but he holds that scepter out, and Esther arose and stood before the king. And notice how humble she is with this. If it pleases the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and the thing seems right to the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes. Why does she say it that way? You think she knew what kind of man she was married to? She's being very careful. Everything's kind of fallen into place. God's watched over her. She's doing what she can, but at the same time, who knows when you'll say the wrong thing in the wrong way and get the wrong result. She's a person. We look at it and say, oh, she'll get whatever she wants, but look at our situation. How many times do we worry about things, or, you know, we're concerned about, is it really going to work out this way or not? We can see the whole picture here, and she didn't know everything about what God would allow to happen or not happen at this point. And she knows the king can be very, very quick-tempered and make some rash decisions at times. And so she just says, look, if it pleases you, if I found favor in your sight, if it seems to you the right thing to do, and I'm pleasing in your eyes. And she knew the answer to that, that he really liked her, loved her in whatever way he would love her, that she found favor in his eyes. And she knew this was the right thing to do, and surely if you could get him just to think about it, he'd realize it as well. Let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman. And, you know, if there's any way, well, you can't, the law of the Medes and Persians, once it's written down, the king's signets on it, it cannot be changed. But you can add to the law in some way to hopefully make things better, you know, because he wrote to annihilate the Jews who are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the evil that will come to my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my countrymen? Think what it's going to do to the country and to the Jews, but think about what it's going to do to me, your queen, how it's going to tear my heart out. And so King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, indeed, I've given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he tried to lay a hand on the Jews. You yourselves write a decree concerning the Jews, as you please, in the king's name. Seal it with the king's signet ring. For whatever is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring, no one can revoke. So he's giving them full power. He'd done that to Haman before, and it caused trouble. But here he's saying, look, you can, however you think is the best way to handle this, you know, that'll make you happy and satisfied. You write it out, you seal it with my seal, and it's done. So the king's scribes were called at that time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day, and it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded to the Jews, the satraps, the governors, the princes, and provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces in all. Now that's going to be a big annihilation that took place. To every province in its own script, to every people in their own language, and to the Jews in their own script and language. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus, sealed it with the king's signet ring, sent letters by couriers on horseback, riding on royal horses, bred from swift steeds. Boy, it gives some details there, doesn't it? Not just they rode out, they rode out on horses that were bred from swift steeds. I mean, they rode out on the fastest horses that you could get. They're going all over the empire. I mean, it's a big empire. It's going to take a while to get to the far reaches of it, but they want to make sure everyone understands what the situation is. They have it in their language. It's read out in their language they'll understand. The Jews have it in their language as well, which is a unique language. I mean, when you look at the Hebrew, and everyone will know what the law is and what the commands are. You go on down as well in verse 11. By those letters the king permitted the Jews who were in every city to gather together and protect their lives, to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the forces of any people or province that would assault them, both little children and women, and to plunder their possessions. So how does that change things? What are the Jews allowed to do? Protect themselves. Fight back. And also, they can plunder as well. I mean, you know, where the other people thought, okay, they're a free target. They're not allowed to fight back. I mean, you know, we have the king's permission to go out and just annihilate them and take their possessions for ourselves or for the king. Now, all of a sudden, we have to fight them. We have to go in combat against them. They're going to be armed. They're going to be ready. They're going to be ready to fight, and they have permission to kill us and to plunder us. And that changes everything, doesn't it? It's one thing to go up against somebody that's defenseless. It's another thing to go to someone who's ready for you to come and is defending what they have and defending their life and the life of their family. And so on one day in all of the provinces, verse 12 of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. And so the copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province, published for all people, so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. And so they rode the royal horses out. They hastened and pressed on by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Shushan, the citadel. So I meant right there in the capital city, throughout the empire as well. And Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, with a great crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. they, of course, they're going to rejoice at whatever the king does, or at least, visually do it. But, you can imagine there's probably other people that felt the same way about Haman that Esther and Mordecai did. I mean, you could see where it went to his head. Jimmy was talking about people today that kind of rise up and get powerful, and you can see where it goes to their head sometimes, and they can become very arrogant and not be the same person. And you can't help but think people notice that with him. But now when Mordecai comes out, they're rejoicing because he stood there at the king's gate, the gate to the palace, and he had discussions with people. He'd been seen day in and day out with people. And so evidently you'd think a man like him would have great respect. But the Jews had light and gladness, joy and honor. In every province and city, wherever the king's command and decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a holiday. Then many of the people of the land became Jews because fear of the Jews fell upon them. So they kind of turned around. They was afraid the Jews were going to get them. So what's the best way to keep a Jew from getting you? Become a Jew. If you can't beat them, join them. So it's kind of interesting how things turn around. And of course, the Jews were ecstatic because they had known the command that we're going to be killed come the end of the year. 11 months down the road. Well, the 12th month finally comes, and the day came for the king's command to be executed. To kill the Jews, but the Jews can fight back. And on the day that the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, the opposite occurred in that the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. You have to see God's providence in this as well. Just because you can defend yourself don't mean you're capable of doing it. A person has somebody break in their house. They have a gun there, but they never used a gun, never fired in any way, and they panic and they kind of shoot every which way and don't wind up protecting themselves. And here they were prepared, and the Jews gathered together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought to harm. They knew the ones that hated them. They knew the ones that wanted to kill them. And so they turned it around and overpowered them. No one could withstand them because fear of them fell upon all people. And again, I think, God, when Israel went in to take the promised land, one of the things he used was he put the fear of Israel in the hearts of the people. They were afraid. You look at with Jericho, what's her name? Rahab. Okay, there we go. Rahab was you look at they were afraid. They'd heard the things they had done, and here there was fear there that fell upon the people, and all the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, all those doing the king's work helped the Jews because of the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. Here's one that has the king's signet ring. Here's one that's in control. He's a Jew. The queen's a Jew. And if we rise up against the Jews, what's going to happen to us? And some did, try to rise up, and they were struck down. But many people that may have thought about doing it would not do it because they realized, I'll be out with the king if I do that. If I live through this, I'm still going to be an enemy. And the Jews defeated all their enemies with a stroke of the sword, really a stroke of a pen as well. And with slaughter and destruction, and did what they pleased with those who hated them. And in Shushan, the citadel, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. And it begins listing the different places of what happened. And in verse 10, the 10 sons of Haman, they killed, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder there. On that day, the number of those who were killed in Shushan, the citadel, was brought to the king. And so here's the king's response. Well, the king said to Esther, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men in Shushan, the citadel, the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It shall be granted you, or what is your further request? It shall be done. So Esther again said, if it pleases the king, let it be granted to the Jews who are in Shushan to do again tomorrow according to today's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. And so it was done, and they hanged his sons. And the Jews in Shushan gathered together again on the 14th day of the month of Adar and killed 300 men at Shushan, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. The remainder of the Jews in the king's provinces gathered together and protected their lives and had rest from their enemies and killed 75,000 of their enemies, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. And so there was a day of feasting and great gladness. You have the Feast of Purim we'll look at for next week. We covered quite a bit. We've been about 3 or 4 weeks behind in this study, and this book had kind of spread it way out, so we're getting a little bit more caught up. Still have a little ways to go. Any comments of what we've covered so far? you know, God's will is going to be done, isn't it? I mean, whether it's through us or through someone else, God uses us, and we never know when we're put in a place for such a time as this and the difference that we can make. I mean, you may say, well, who am I? But you look at Esther. Who was she before she became queen? I mean, just Esther that was an orphan, Esther that was raised by her cousin, you know, little old Esther. But look at what she was able to accomplish, and Mordecai was able to accomplish, ultimately what God was able to accomplish as well. Any closing comments? Let's see, we'll go over next week. We can kind of, if you see anything in the previous book lessons you want to cover, I mean, we'll kind of touch on some of those. But next week, for those that are in here, we'll look at the Feast of Purim, beginning at Esther, lesson number 13. And then we'll have the new books by next week that we'll be able to give to you, and we can go from there. Appreciate the discussion.